Hello, everyone. It's Frances Widdowson here. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. And for people who have not seen the disputations before, the format is to invite someone on whose work I find interesting or who I admire. And then for the first hour, I ask the guest questions, and then to keep things fair and also to cover anything that I missed. What happens is I turn the interviewing over to the guest, and then the guest interviews me for an hour. So, and for today, we have, my guest is Chanel Pfahl. And Chanel and I met, I guess, around 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, because we're part of the same group called Lighthouse, which is combating wokeism in the school system to some extent. And I'm trying to develop linkages with groups like Lighthouse so that we can have a opposition to wokeism, a broad based opposition to wokeism. And I admire Chanel a great deal, because Chanel is on the front lines of the battle against wokeism in the school system, and has had some controversies pertaining to this, which we're hoping to get into in much more detail in this program. So welcome to the Rational Space Disputations, Chanel.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Anyway, so to start things off, perhaps maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're interested in, and then we can start getting into your controversy that you were involved in.
Sure. So I'm a high school teacher. I studied biology. I'm also really into languages. I did a minor in French, and I got to teach both of these subjects for a couple of years. And then it started getting a little bit dramatic. I said some comments about critical race theory, and I got in a bit of trouble for that. So yeah, I'll tell you all about it.
And so what grades did you teach in the school system?
So I taught 7 to 12, primarily I'd say 7 to 9 with,
Okay.
yeah.
And that's in the Ontario school system. Ottawa, you're based in Ottawa, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm in Ontario. I was teaching in Barrie, however, not Ottawa.
Okay.
I recently moved to Ottawa, yeah.
All right, Chanel, tell us all about what happened to you with respect to
all right.
file.
Well, yeah, so in February 2021, I put a comment in a Facebook group, which was a group for teachers. You had to give your member code, your regulatory body member code to be a part of the group. So everybody was verified teachers. And somebody asked about whether others could share resources about Black Lives Matter. And obviously, this is a political thing. I don't think it belongs in a classroom. So I just said basically that I don't think we should be indoctrinating kids with critical race theory, which is essentially what BLM is. And I just said, schools should be nonpartisan and things like that. Anyway, I got pretty much mobbed right away, and someone complained, and then that led to an investigation. And then a month later, I was suspended without pay for a week. And then that was kind of, well, I thought it was over. And then a whole year later, in March of this year, so 2022, I was sent another letter, which told me that I was under investigation yet again, but this time not by my school board, but by the Ontario College of Teachers, and they are investigating me for the same comments that I made in that group, which so it was the one about critical race theory, not indoctrinating kids with it. And I also had posted a video of a UK member of parliament giving a speech about critical race theory. So yeah, that's just an ongoing thing. And Yeah.
So the first one was the school board investigating you, and the
Yeah.
second one is going to be the regulatory body, which sounds a bit more serious because that probably covers all the schools in Ontario. Would that be, it regulates all the schools in Ontario?
Yeah, it regulates all the members, all teachers in Ontario have to be members of the OCT. So they have, they're the people that I pay my licensing fees to. They can revoke my license. They can do whatever they deem to be appropriate.
So with respect to the first investigation, because I've had quite a lot of experience with these circumstances, what happened with that? Like, what did you have? Did you have to meet with an investigator? What went on with that, with the investigation itself?
Yeah, so I got to meet with an investigator one time. I had a meeting with them. It was probably like 30 minutes long, where the allegations against me were brought up and I was able to defend myself. I guess I didn't do a great job of that because a week later I was still suspended, but
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, Chanel.
doesn't matter.
So, and who complained about you?
I don't know who she is. I know she's a teacher. I'm assuming she's a teacher because she was in the group, but other than that, I know nothing about her, and she doesn't know
You
me
don't know the
either.
name of the person. Did you get a? Oh,
I do know that her name, just because it's been in the documents, but I haven't shared her name because I don't think that would be very nice.
yeah, they told you who she was. Did you get a dated and signed complaint?
A dated and signed complaint?
Yeah, from her.
Yeah, like I have all the documents.
Okay.
I have everything that she wrote about me. Yeah.
And in the investigation and final thing about the procedures, because this is very, very important. Did you get a copy of the investigator's report?
Report as in?
Yeah, so I don't know how it goes on, what goes on in the school, it's the school system, but from my experience, what happens is the investigator, asks you a bunch of questions and everything like that. There might be some follow-ups, and then they have a report. But was the investigator a lawyer?
I don't believe so. So we're dealing with two different situations here, right? Like the first one was the school board had people, I don't even know who, there was a panel of people who were evaluating my case from the school board. And I think maybe, yeah, I don't even know, to be honest. But now it's a whole different set of people, but I've been lucky. I haven't really had to deal with them directly because I'm represented by lawyers. So
but this is a professional body you're talking about. Like so there's, from what I understand, there's two kinds of processes. One concerned your school board, etc. And so on. And then the second is now you've got these lawyers involved who are going to be representing you, and that's with your professional regulatory body.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so for the first one, did you meet with the investigator for that?
I met with a representative from the school board.
Okay, but it wasn't an outside investigator in that one.
No.
And then in the second one, they're bringing in an outside investigator.
Well, I think that they're not necessarily outside investigators. I think they're part of the Ontario College of Teachers. Like they have investigators on hand.
Okay.
So,
and with the first investigation, which was done by the school board itself, what kinds of things did they ask you in that investigation?
Honestly, I can't really remember, but I know that like basically they just brought up the allegation against me. They said, so the way that they had written it was I made comments about visible minorities. So they just brought up what I had written and they let me say what I wanted to say, which was essentially that, like what I just said to you, is that it's a political thing. I don't have any problem with anybody having those views, but I do have a problem with them bringing it into the school and pushing this narrative on children, which to me is completely counter to what education even is. I mean, we're not supposed to be teaching kids what to think.
Yeah.
Should be how to think. We should be able to look at both sides, right? So that was essentially my comment. And at the time, I wasn't really expecting it to go further than that. I thought that my arguments made sense, and that any reasonable person would just say, oh yeah, I mean, how can we don't have anything to stand on here. But no, apparently that's not the case.
Yeah. And so you went through these questions, you defended yourself on what you thought at the time was enough to answer their concerns about it. And then did you receive some kind of decision from them?
Yeah, so I got a letter that said that like this, you're suspended for a week. I wasn't, so it was without pay. I couldn't go on school property. I couldn't talk to parents. I couldn't talk to colleagues. I couldn't talk to anybody. I was essentially treated like a criminal. And yeah, it was, I mean, it was damaging to my reputation too. I just felt like it was, you know, it wasn't like me to tell a parent I'm going to call them and then not call them. You know what I mean? And I was put in that situation where I was forced to do that. So
yeah. But when they gave you your, gave you your notice of your suspension, what did they tell you about your wrongdoing?
Oh, I commented on visible minorities. That was the point that had to do with the comments in that group that I made. And they had also found two other allegations against me, which I probably won't get into now because they're not exactly relevant to wokeism and whatnot, but they dug up some stuff and added it on, which I'm told is something that they kind of do to maybe justify their treatment of me. I don't know. Anyway, it was all very unfair, and I'm in the process of appealing it now through the union. So that's going to take a while, though. It's not until May of 2023 that I have my arbitration for that. So that'll be like 2 years, more than 2 years after the initial complaint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. But from what I understand, reading your materials, you didn't mention anything to do with minorities.
No, I didn't.
You just said that you didn't think it was right to have this political thing pushed on people in the school system.
Yeah. It's so odd to me that they can go from what I said and make it into a comment about visible minorities. For starters, I don't even think my comment mentioned visible minorities whatsoever.
I think it was just about the like, you know, people, the difference between people having their own views and so on versus the school itself taking a position on this and getting people to accept that and teach that and so on. Seems
exactly. Yeah.
So your union, how do you feel about your union with respect to this?
I mean, I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I don't really know. It looks like the appeal was done in a way that is legitimately defending me, and it feels like they've made a genuine effort, and I'm really happy about that. Sometimes I get a bit concerned with things that I see coming from the union, like taking ideological positions that I disagree with, and that I think a lot of teachers also disagree with. And I don't think that that's right either. Just as much as a school shouldn't be taking sides politically, a union shouldn't either, because they have a duty to represent all individuals and just their rights to have different opinions. And that makes it really weird for somebody like me, you know, when I'm seeking their support, but I'm not sure if they genuinely want to defend me.
Mm. Have they made any comments about critical race theory, the union?
Yeah, they have. I don't know if they've specifically mentioned CRT, but I mean, this stuff gets so muddied, right? Like people, they don't necessarily recognize that something is critical race theory being applied because they might not know enough about critical race theory. Like, for example, they'll say, "Oh, well, critical race theory isn't taught in schools," and I guess we can get technical and about it. If we get technical about it, sorry, that might be true. You know, like we aren't necessarily telling kids that are 5, look, the world is made of oppressors and oppressed and blah blah blah. We're not teaching necessarily the theory of it, but we're applying its principles. So it's the same thing with the union. I don't know if they've made a comment about critical race theory specifically, but I know that they take positions when it comes to anti-Black racism and things like that, which are inspired by critical race theory.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps for our viewers, it might be helpful to talk a little bit about what this is, critical race theory. So in your view, you say that critical race theory as a well-articulated kind of system of ideas perhaps is not being taught, but there are certain ways that it's being applied in the school system. Can you just elaborate a bit upon what, first of all, what you think critical race theory is, and then second, how it's being applied in the school system?
Sure. So critical race theory is a kind of view of, well, it can be described in many ways. Some people say it's a branch of activism. Others say it's a disciplinary, academic discipline. But like, to me, what critical race theory is a view of society that is based on race. So it's a way of viewing relations in society through the lens of race at all times. It assumes that every white person is racist, that the fundamental kind of value of our society is white supremacy, and that white people uphold white supremacy without even knowing that they're doing so. And that, you know, to say that you're not racist is racist in itself. It's a theory that is unfalsifiable, because any objection that you have to it is taken as proof that the theory is accurate. They'll say, well, if you say that you're not racist, that means you are racist, because the fundamental assumption of the theory is that everybody is racist. There's no way to disagree with it. It's a view of the world that's cynical. It assumes a lot of things about groups, about individuals based on their group membership. If you're white, certain things are assumed about you. If you're Black, certain things are assumed about you. So it's a race essentialist theory. It jumps to conclusions about many things. Like it seems to not know the difference between causality and correlation, because it sees disparities in outcomes, and then it assumes that all of those disparities are due to one thing and one thing only, and that is racism. So it's a very, very flawed theory, and it puts aside it doesn't consider what we have in common with people of all different races. It brushes aside our common humanity, and it divides us further.
And it seems to me that any kind of disparity that is witnessed is attributed to racism. Is that what is sort of is what's happening a little bit? So, and I never really identified it specifically as critical race theory, because I find it is it's a difficult thing to pin down. But you'll hear, for example, that there's there's no administrators, or there's very few administrators who are Black, for example, or who are Indigenous. And then it will say, well, that's obviously because of systemic racism, that that's the case. That's that seems to me to be the evidence that's often presented.
It's the only evidence that they ever have, it seems to me. But only if it's in one direction. So you're not going to get anyone to who's saying, oh, look at this basketball team, it's all Black people, they must be racist because there's an outcome disparity. You know what I mean? It's only if white people are ahead. It just assumes that it must be due to racism. There have, to my knowledge, there have not been any multivariate analyses of this. It's just assumptions. It's lived experiences, but only the lived experiences that confirm the theory, and not those that disconfirm it. So the fact that we're reorganizing society based on this is appalling.
And even like Black people who you would say, right, if we're going to listen to the lived experience of Black people, but then you have a Black person who will disagree with the tenets of critical race theory, and then for some reason that Black person is not going to be listened to.
Absolutely.
Is there some kind of I'm just kind of, it could just be purely opportunistic kind of stuff, but is there some kind of intellectual basis for that? Like, has that been articulated as to why certain Black people should be listened to and other Black people should not be listened to?
I think it's this idea of unconscious bias and stuff like that. They assume that the Black people that are speaking against it think that way because of the white supremacy that they've been born into and socialized to believe is the way. So that's how they just decide to trash their opinion and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about because you're brainwashed into this like white supremacy way of thinking, which is to me just so racist in itself. I mean, you can't say that you're not racist if you listen to somebody's opinion, and just because they're Black, you make assumptions about them, about why they think a certain way, and about why they're not allowed to think that way. Like, why is that allowed? Why is that seen as okay? It's a mystery to me.
What is your definition of racism?
I guess it would be just the traditional definition. So judging or treating someone differently based on their race, viewing them as inferior or something like that.
Because often that was historically how people saw that, and it actually had a political character to it. So it was, you thought someone was inferior because of their race, and you thought that they should have fewer political rights on this basis. So historically, it wasn't just simply that you didn't, I don't know if that makes any sense. You didn't like people who were Black or Indigenous or whatever. You might have had that opinion, but unless you believed that they should be granted fewer rights than other people on the basis of their race, then that you were not really sort of falling within that kind of specific definition of racism.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, so application. So, okay. So as far as I understand it, which I think is gently, there might be some arguments about that we're bastardizing this or something, but certainly race is seen as being a key category. And I guess to some extent, it has some of this intersectionality ideas associated with it. So, or I'm not sure if that's necessary for the theory. So you could have this idea that the system exists so that whites get privileges and so on because of their whiteness, and therefore it's in their interest to keep BIPOC people down in this kind of lower status within society. Is it always got the intersectionality thing associated with it, like you've got black and white, and then you've got like a sort of this kind of spectrum, this kind of hierarchy of races, but then you've also got to consider women or sexual orientation and all these things? Is that, you always see that happening together, or are they sometimes separate from one another?
I think it's fair to say that they're pretty intertwined. Like the way that I've seen it, it's always kind of in a broader like oppression matrix where, you know, you can determine how oppressed you are. It's basically become like as Gad Saad says, like oppression Olympics, where the more oppressed you are, the more your voice matters and the more authentic you're viewed as. But of course, it's only if you share the views of the woke ideology. You could be the most oppressed person according to the intersectional matrix, but if you don't share that victimhood mentality, or if you don't want to follow along with this narrative of oppression and oppress, then your voice is just going to be tossed out. But yeah, to answer your question, I do think that they're linked. Where I've seen it, it's always been kind of in a broader,
yeah.
And
application. So how do you see this as being applied within the school system?
I mean, it's no secret that it's all over the place. The government publications are like, they will say that, first of all, that systemic racism exists, and that it's if you're white, you're privileged, and if you're Black, you've been oppressed for years and years. And the proof that they have to give, like we mentioned earlier, is outcome disparities. So in the government publications, they will say, for example, Black kids have higher suspension rates or higher dropout rates and things like that, and take that as proof of systemic racism. So I'd say in the school system, it's not necessarily that we're sitting down with the kids and talking about critical race theory as a theory, like I said, but it's like our worldview is embedded in this theory so completely that we cannot get away from it. Everything in school now, I mean, from the moment that you walk in, there's usually posters and things about racism, about BLM, or about white privilege and things like that. And I'm against racism, just like most other Canadians. I mean, 99.9% of Canadians are against racism. But I just see that as being, I mean, it's racist in itself. We're encouraging kids to look at race first, to judge people on their race. And it's not right. The focus on race is just going to create more divisions. And at the same time, we're not showing kids how to think with this stuff, because what they're learning is that to win an argument, you just have to be, say, more self-righteous, more confident, more emotional, and then you will silence the opposition, and that's it. You know, we're not valuing actual good arguments anymore, and I see that as being really problematic, because in a couple of years, in 10 years, 20 years, these students are going to be the ones running the show, running the government, running just society, but they won't have the foundational skills required to actually think.
So you see a lot of this in terms of, what I guess I would consider to be public announcements, public relations kind of materials. But like when you're teaching science,
Mhm.
does this enter into the teaching of the actual subject matter in any way?
I think there are some things being developed at the curriculum level at the moment, but right now I would say that it's more dependent on the teacher. You get some teachers who are very ideologically minded, and they have the freedom to espouse their views, and they're not only not punished for it, but they're encouraged to keep it up. But you have other teachers who manage to stay away from it pretty well too. So it's not something that I would say is enforced in a way. It can't really be enforced that much. It can be encouraged for now. But
curriculum, I'd be very interested in the curriculum. Like, for example, and I haven't read this article because I don't think we got it here in Alberta. It was about the Ontario school system. They had some kind of proposals. I'm not sure if it actually got implemented or not, for the teaching of Indigenous science in the curriculum. Have you heard about that? And that would be an example of, and I just saw this in, I think it was John Kay I get a lot of this kind of information from his Twitter account, but there was some kind of and this wasn't the school system, but this is the kind of thing that goes on, which it has curricular implications. There was something about hiring people to teach about Black knowledges within some kind of, I'm not sure if it was an after school program or some kind of, so there seems to be some effort to have teaching of things in a way that is shaped by critical race theory. And I assume the assumption is, which is what I see in the Indigenous science area, that, one of the reasons why Indigenous students don't do very well in science is because the science is colored by whiteness. And so the solution to that, according to sort of critical race theory like types of rationale, the reasons that are given, is that you have to kind of bring in the Indigenous science so that Indigenous students can feel comfortable within the science. Do you see anything like that in the school system at this stage?
I haven't seen anything officially in the curriculums, but then again, I haven't necessarily read like the whole, there's always a lot of pages before you actually get into the curriculum for any course. I haven't seen it in the science curriculum itself, but I have heard of these ideas from a lot of people, some who it's quite surprising to hear them have these views. Like, for example, people who have PhDs in biology, or bachelors of science. It's I think it's just a frame of mind. It feels good to have these ideas, to want to kind of almost sacrifice a little bit to bring in these other ideas, because it just feels like inclusive and good. But to me, science is science. I don't judge a scientific concept based on the identity of the person who came up with the theory or whatever. It just has no relevance whatsoever. If an Indigenous person has a great scientific finding, great, let's add it in there. But I don't want to add in indigenous knowledge or whatever just because the person is Indigenous. That's I mean, the fact that we're even considering that kind of thing blows my mind.
Yeah. So we have, just to get a sense of what's going on with respect to critical race theory in the schools, we have general kinds of statements and so on, assumptions that are being made about the reasons why certain things are perhaps not proportional. So you don't have 5% of teachers or administrators or whatever being Aboriginal, and this must be due to some kind of racist kind of thing, suspension. So do you see pressure, like if they're thinking about suspending a Black student or a BIPOC student, they say, oh, well, we maybe shouldn't do that because that will then contribute to the number? Like, is this sort of thing going on within the school system?
Yeah, I would say it is. When I was there, I don't have firsthand experiences with this, but I have been receiving a lot of messages from teachers over the last couple weeks or months, I guess. And a lot of them are echoing that exact worry, is that we're really starting to, because we're so focused on the outcome, we're starting to kind of let that lead the way in terms of the decisions that we make for dealing with disciplinary cases or academic issues. We don't want the outcomes to look bad. And I mean, the ones who lose out with this in the end are going to be the Black students, because lowering the bar in order to have an equitable appearance in the end is not good for them whatsoever.
Yeah. So what years were you going through the teacher education process yourself?
So I was in Teachers College from 2015 to 2017.
Okay. And have you seen a change over time in your, like, is it, was this part of your teacher education program that you were seeing this critical race theory types of stuff? Or did that just start to come in when you became a teacher? How much is this within the teacher education programs?
Well, I was at Laurentian University, and I didn't find it I didn't find it that bad, to be honest. But at the time, I also wasn't really politically aware of these things. I was a little bit blissfully ignorant, let's just put it that way. Yeah. So none of it would have necessarily rang an alarm for me at that time.
Yeah. You were mentioning on the Benjamin Boyce program about the some kind of, I'm not sure if it was a women's studies kind of program, but it was about a woman who was pulling yarn out of her vagina as some kind of pro-menstruation kind of thing.
Yeah, it was so empowering to the women, pulling out discolored yarn.
So what kind of teachers education? This was teacher education.
No, it was not teacher education. Okay. This was I took a little bit. My interests are all over the place. I'm seriously curious about everything. And I took courses in theater. I took courses in women's studies. I did gerontology. Like I just wanted to learn a little bit about everything. And so I took this class. It was motherhood. I think it was called Motherhood and something. I don't know.
Okay.
And it was just so bizarre. The things that we were made to discuss and the positions that I felt I had to take, and back then, unfortunately, I wish now that I could take a class like that. I don't want to pay the money for it though. So if anyone wants to pay for me to take a class and be a shit disturber, let me know. But at the time, I just wish that I had the information, the background to come forward and oppose some of these topics. But at the time I felt really intimidated because the whole class seemed to be like eating it up and just so on board with it. It was this weird kind of feeling just being there, because it's like you feel like you're part of this group that's like revolutionary, awesome, like just great people coming together. We're going to smash the patriarchy. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And it blinds you to I guess, your own principles in a way when you become a part of this collective, right? It's really scary.
But was that just like an exceptional course, or did you find there was quite a few of the courses that you were taking that had that kind of character to it?
No, only the ones that were in the women's studies, gender studies kind of departments. I think I took 2 classes like that in total.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
It's funny though, because I noticed this myself in these kind of environments where there's kind of some crazy things going on, and everyone there is really into it. And you're kind of looking around for people who are maybe a little bit skeptical about it. And occasionally you do find your eyes meet with someone you're kind of going, oh my God. But there is quite a, and I guess it's, to some extent, it's sort of the emotion that is coming out in that sort of context, I guess. The political kind of, it's like a rally, a political, it's not really an educational kind of environment. It's a political rally kind of environment.
Absolutely. And Jonathan Haidt talks about this too, where when you're in a group, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. If you're singing, you're dancing, you're marching, you know, if you're in the army or something like that, there is this kind of higher, I don't know what, I forget how he described it, but there's this kind of other level that you go to where you become a part of a collective and you're energized by it. So
so now you're in the teaching kind of thick of things. What are your other teachers? What's going on with your other teachers with respect to these kinds of developments?
I would really like to know what's going on with them. I would like them to reach out to me and tell me what they think, but most of them have just been quiet.
So you don't get a lot of communications from other teachers about your situation and what's going on?
I'm talking about the ones I know in real life, not really.
Okay.
I've gotten a few, but not really enough for my liking personally. Like I know that they're seeing what's happening. I can see that they're looking at my stories on Facebook, on Instagram, and they just never say anything. And to me, that is just almost the worst part of this. I can handle people attacking me, disagreeing with me. I love that. It's like, come at me. I would love to discuss this. I don't care if you disagree. Like I want to battle these. I want us to exchange ideas, but it's just so crushing to me that people don't even feel that they can speak up. I don't know if it's because they're scared of agreeing with me or because they're scared of disagreeing with me, but there's something that's happening where people don't want to voice their opinions, and or maybe they're just busy. I mean, there's that too, but you know what I mean? It is a little bit crushing when I feel like, you know, I'm this young professional, my career is at stake. I worked with these people for a long time. We had good times together. I went to their house, they came to mine, we went for drinks, all of these things, and they see this happening and they just ignore it.
There's this thing, and this is also the Haidt and Lukianoff book about the witch hunt kind of situation, though. What happens in witch hunts, which is you don't want to defend the person because you're going to be stamped as a witch too. Like that's often the thing that happens in these scenarios as well. Even if they there's a danger even in disagreeing with someone, because you might not disagree in the right way. Like this is kind of like the difficulty when you see all these people ripping each other apart in these contexts and trying to get people removed from their positions and so on. Often it's people who are sort of almost the most alike that are the most vicious in terms of going after one another, because this particular kind of dispute has the potential to unravel whatever kind of doctrinal point which is being, you know, advocated for. So it's kind of a very dangerous. Now I think people are realizing it's a very dangerous kind of terrain to kind of enter into discussions at all. Even if you are a pro critical race theory person, you could accidentally, you know, mischaracterize,
screw up a word, or you're
out. You're on the
what these people should realize, though, maybe not the pro CRT people, but the others, is that yes, it's dangerous to speak out, but it's going to get more dangerous to speak out. And once, you know, if you don't want to associate with me because you're scared that you're going to be targeted too, trust me, they're going to come for you. It's not going to be long. Give it a year, give it 2 years. There's going to be some kind of boundary where you don't want to go along with it. You don't say the right word. You don't do something. And trust me, I'm not in this position because I'm morally defective. I'm actually a normal person who's just been shot in a bit of the public eye because of a reasonable opinion. And it could be you next. And at one point, a lot of us are going to have to stand together and say enough's enough and take that risk because, you know, we're not asking you to go to war. We're not asking you to risk your life. It's just so important to speak the truth and to pay a cost if you must for speaking the truth, but do it because the cost is just going up and it's not going to stop until enough people decide that they're willing to pay that cost.
Yeah, and as well, and Kathleen Lowry, who's a colleague of mine from the University of Alberta, she mentioned to me, which struck me as well, is like, you know, it's not like we're in Latin America in the times of the, you know, Pinochet regime and the Argentina, like the terrible dictatorships where people would be they would disappear and they would be killed, and these kinds of really horrible autocratic kinds of consequences that would happen. We're not there yet at that stage. We could get there. Like, this is how things get there, is by people just kind of going along with things, and then this kind of autocratic kind of character becoming stronger and stronger and stronger until, you know,
you can't stop it anymore.
Afraid. Like, you know, but there is a difficulty, I think, and that's why I think my key, like, I'm such a powerful figure, is I will fight to the end. Like, I don't want, obviously I want my job and I want to be a professor, but I'm prepared to fight it out and just take the consequences of not having my job anymore. Like, whereas I think most people, if you take away their livelihood, especially if they have a family and they have all these kinds of things, you know, like, you can sort of see how, like, well, that's a lot to ask someone to put their job on the line for these kinds of things. And that's why I guess the unions, this is hoping, like, I think the unions is a serious problem. Like, the unions that do not defend the workers who are trying to speak out against this, is that the union should be kind of at the front of the crowd, trying to battle it out and stop the employers from punishing, you know, people like yourself who.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think these dynamics are happening all over in these like micro environments. So like within the union itself, there's probably witch hunts and there's probably these purity things going on, you know, where you can't, people are made aware that they cannot disagree. And it's the same with students now. Like, even if you have a teacher who's completely not woke, if I went into a classroom, I'm not going to be preaching about my political views. I'm against that. I'm going to be impartial. But even then, students have started to kind of enact these kind of dynamics just among themselves. I've heard this from parents, from teachers. They see it happening where one will shame the other, or, you know, where students just don't want to share their opinion because they are so aware of what's going to happen to them. And I blame social media in large part for this, because it's just too easy to bully and silence and ostracize when you have access to these devices that you can just slam someone with hardly any consequences and things like that. So
yeah. So in your view, how can this be battled? This monster?
We're gonna need well, I won't claim to be an expert here. I have no idea, to be honest. It's really scary to look at, but I do think.
Have you found some things that have worked for you? Like, is there certain things that have worked?
Well, I've been speaking quite openly on Instagram and on Facebook, and I have had some people who have reached out to say, I wasn't aware that this was happening. and I'm paying more attention now, and thank you for bringing these ideas to my attention, like these problems to my attention. So that's really encouraging. But I don't know, other than just people being courageous and speaking the truth and putting this information out there, having these kinds of conversations where people can see a different viewpoint and see maybe that we're not two hateful people, we're not alt-right bigots, we're just normal people who want freedom of speech, and we want to maintain freedom in the West. And I just think we need to speak to other people as much as possible, like whoever, like I take these opportunities all the time where I just see somebody in public or whatever, and I'll bring it up just randomly, because most people agree with my view, and I think that they are just not aware of what's happening. Like if they don't have kids in the system, or if they don't have any kind of ties to this stuff, say they're older or whatever, they might not know what's happening. They might just
What about the parents? What about the parents in the system? Like, do the parents, because that's part of it too, if the parents start to get a little bit, become critical about what's going on in terms of the dogmatism of it, right? Like that's the difficult, like, this is what I find to be the disturbing thing about it is, like, as you're mentioning, the proportionate representation, those kinds of questions, these are quite complicated, sort of social science types of questions as to why there are certain numbers of positions and so on. But you feel like with this whole dogmatism that that's got to be the answer that you find. And if you find another answer, that's not going to go well for you. So, parents, in terms of how their children are being educated, do you find that they have a sense that there's things going wrong in the school system?
I don't really think so, to be honest. I don't know. It's hard to say what the percentage would be, but I think a lot of them just have this trust in the system. And I don't want to speak badly about just public education in general. But some of these ideas are very dangerous, and I don't really think that parents see it yet, but they will. I think they will see it when their kids start to bring up some of these ideas, and hopefully parents will reject it completely and speak up at that point. I know a lot of them have been reaching out and trying to get involved, but they don't get too far. They feel like when they voice their concerns, they're not really heard and things like that, which is really sad, because I mean, public education belongs to all of us, and each parent should be able to teach to send their kids to school and feel that their kids are going to be educated in terms of writing and science and math and things like that, and that their moral values can be established in their home. I mean, that's kind of how it was before. I'm not against teachers telling kids to be respectful and enforcing certain rules that we all agree with, but when it comes to these political ideas that are highly controversial, I think it's a really disrespectful thing to do to parents, to just sort of say, well, regardless of what you want, this is what we're teaching, and you have no say. I don't know. It just seems really, really backwards to me.
What about the school boards? Like getting people elected to school boards, has there been any success in that? Like, I know there's been some movement and encouragement for people who are concerned about wokeism or critical race theory or whatever it is, to kind of get board members. And I know that's something John Kay has been posting a lot, is certain boards. I'm not sure which board it is, but it's the one where you two probably followed.
Waterloo.
Burkowski, I think her last name is.
Burjowski, yeah.
Burjowski and there's a board chair, and there's a guy by the name of Mike Ramsey who got kicked off the board. Like, there's a lot of politics going on there that if we could just organize enough to get members of the school board in place who could sort of, fight back against these kinds of tendencies, then that might have what's your thoughts on that possibility?
Yeah, that's one of the most important things, I think. And we have to get a lot of people in there too. It's not just one or two people, because I know a lot of the how it works in those school board meetings is they have votes. So say if you get elected into that position, it's not necessarily whether your arguments are good or not and whether you'll be able to convince the others. They're not going to be convinced. They're ideological Puritans for the most part. So what you need is to have many members who are not woke, who value real education, to outnumber the others. I know a lot of people are getting involved. Like I now know, I think 3 people who are going to be running for school board trustee in different spots. Hopefully many others will. I mean, I don't know how much it pays. I think it's like 15,000 a year or something like that. And it is demanding and it is hard and you're going to be slammed probably, but it is really important if you can do it.
Yeah, because I wonder how much there is. Like there's the bullies kind of on these school boards, but then there's people who are just being bullied and who don't want to speak up because of the clan. Well, as we saw with the Berjowski case, she tries to just raise what seemed to be, for people who don't know that case, I believe she has a fundraiser as well. She was just, raising questions about why these books were in the library from, I think it was kindergarten to grade 6, which had, basically it was promoting transitioning and puberty blockers and so on as being part of these books that very young children would be reading. She just asked a question as to whether that was appropriate to have these books in the library. And she gets thrown out of the meeting and told that she's engaged in hate speech and all this kind of thing. And then everyone who's watching that, no one really wants to have that kind of thing happen to them in that context. And so they just kind of go along with it. So in terms of the dynamics, it's not very well known as to what is actually the sort of the characteristics of the people that are on these boards. But certainly that could be a way into it. A relatively easy way into it is through that process.
Yeah. I've heard that the school board trustees are often just re-elected because there's nobody else that's running too. So it's not like it's a super hard, it's not like it's super hard to get elected. I think if you put your name in, chances are parents will like your message and stuff if you just stand for reason and rationality and equality and all of these things that I think we're, as a society, we're like dying for. So many people just want to see, like, just you know what I mean. Just
so what's
proper
your future?
stuff.
What's your future, Chanel? Like, what's
my future?
What are you planning on? Like, what are your plans with respect to all this kind of stuff that's going on?
Oh, I try not to think too far ahead, to be honest, because it would stress me out.
Arbitration is 2023.
Yeah.
And you have organization that's defending you with legal help.
Yeah. So the Democracy Fund is defending my investigation with the Ontario College of Teachers.
Okay. Is that going to be public? That
I hope so.
Yeah, because that's another kind of important thing, is to get it so that people can see what goes on. I find that what happened with the board, I find that's absolutely outrageous that happened.
What board are you talking?
The board that investigated you and
found
you, suspended you without pay. So like if the similar kind of thing goes on with the investigatory kind of, like, who knows, like you were mentioning at the beginning that, you felt that you hadn't defended yourself very well because of the result that happened. But I think it's important to point out that often the decisions are made even before the investigation take place.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah,
and that's
I mean,
kind of
the fact that
uh,
they received the complaint and didn't just disregard it
I know.
to begin with is very worrisome. It's
Yeah,
like, well, somebody made a complaint, they were offended by my comment, but who's to say? I mean, I'm offended by her comment,
yeah,
so who wins? Like, it's who's deciding who being whether being offended is
yeah,
like valid or not. Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
yeah. Do you
Yeah.
see that are you hoping for a future in teaching still?
I am just really, really looking forward to getting back in a classroom. All of this has just made me feel more passionate about teaching,
Mm,
more I'm like longing to get back into a classroom so that I can just be a neutral voice when it comes to this stuff,
mm,
and actually teach kids to be critical thinkers. I woke up fairly recently, as I said, in terms of my political views and whatnot. I used to not really pay attention to politics much, and I just was a little bit naive in terms of if I was told that something was good, or it seemed good because it said the word inclusive and it said the word kind or whatever, then
yeah.
I might be prone to following what they were saying. But so I mean, I started my teaching career off like that, where I didn't really know too much, and that was only 5 years ago, I guess.
Yeah.
So I've just changed a lot since then, and I really hope that I'm able to um, just apply what I know now to my future teaching.
Mm. On that note, well, we've reached the hour point, Chanel.
Have we? Oh my gosh,
I know, it's
that went
amazing.
by fast.
It goes by really quick. Uh, so it's an hour's gone by, so it's time to turn the
Okay.
screens, and
Okay.
I'll let you take over. And as we mentioned, you can either follow up on certain things that we were talking about in the last hour, or you can choose completely new things.
Okay. Well, perfect. I have some questions that I kind of thought through, and I'd like to ask you about your situation and your background and all of this. I have followed your case,
Mm,
not, I wouldn't say super closely, but I have heard you in interviews. I've read some of your articles and whatnot, so I know a bit of what's going on. But I do want to ask some like general questions too for
mhm.
people who might just be learning about you. But
Yeah.
I'm curious. So you've been researching indigenous stuff for a long time, right? Like, for how long now?
It started, I guess, in about 1995.
Oh wow.
So I was working for the government of the Northwest Territories. Right, I graduated with my master's. I went up there to work for the government just because I thought that's what I wanted to do. And I got hired in this department called the Department of Renewable Resources, which was trying to incorporate what they called traditional knowledge into all government programs and services. So that was something, I believe it was a new directive that had come down. And so I was involved in figuring out how this was going to happen. Like, what was this going to entail? And I was, talking to a bunch of different people, and the Broken Hill Properties diamond mine was coming in to the Northwest Territories at the time. And this was one of the directives of the environmental assessment process, was to incorporate traditional knowledge into the assessment of the diamond mine. Anyway, and Albert Howard, who was the co-person I was write many things with, and actually we were writing things on traditional knowledge together. He was working for Indigenous organizations at the time as well. And so we started to realize relatively early on and looking at it that this was not something that was going to improve the environmental assessment process. It was a
Where
political type of initiative that was meant to basically buy off the indigenous groups. So indigenous groups were resisting various forms of development, which, you know, that's a political issue as to whether that was correct or not. Maybe there's harms, but to get them to accept these developments, there was money that was being paid out, and the traditional knowledge kind of stuff was a disguise of this kind of the payoffs that were happening. And so then in the Northwest Territories, I got suspended there because Albert and I wrote this article in a journal called Policy Options, called Traditional Knowledge Threatens Environmental Assessment. So it was talking about how this actually was going to have negative effects for environmental assessment. Anyway, I got suspended because I was a government employee. I didn't write it as a government employee, I wrote it as a private citizen, but I was told that this was like somehow violating my governmental thing. So I thought at the time, this isn't going to work, me being in the government, because I want to talk about these things and I'm not going to be able to talk about them. So I will go into the university system where, you know, the pursuit of truth and the, you know, critical thinking and discussion of new ideas and new ways of thinking about things are welcomed and so on. And then I began that kind of that kind of saga in the university system, finding out that there were difficulties as well in the university system.
Okay, so when you started in the university, what were you mainly focused on? Like, what was the object of your research?
Yes, so I was in, so Indigenous policy was the area of my research. And I went to York University because I was interested in political economy, which was the kind of the economic and political kinds of foundations for Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. And this was a very weak area of political economy, actually, is that political economy often didn't really take into account Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations and various kinds of conceptualization of the historical development of Canada. And so I was actually on the cutting edge of this, looking at the Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations from a political economy standpoint. And this was not appreciated. The thing about the political economy is that it has an evolutionary kind of understanding of things. So, and there's kind of the historical materialism position, which is looking at labor. And then there would be sort of the Adam Smith kind of type of perspective, which would be looking at trade and markets and so on, capitalist developments, capitalism. But what this kind of started to get into, which was very, very unpopular, was that Indigenous hunting and gathering societies are less developed in terms of production. Economically less developed.
So this was what you said that they didn't like?
Yeah. So
okay.
So I was doing actually a critique of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, because the Royal Commission just was not accepting this kind of political economy kind of framework. It was rejecting it and saying, in fact, to see it that way was racist and so on. That was essentially the Royal Commission's perspective.
So they were rejecting it just because it didn't feel good, mainly. Like they didn't have any arguments to make that were based in.
Well, so this gets into, so their argument essentially would be what's called post-colonial theory. So they do have an argument, but the argument is kind of relativistic. So the idea is that each culture is equally developed in its own kind of, according to its own criteria.
Right. So this culture might be mutilating young girls or whatever, but because all cultures are the same and should be valued and not judged, we need to, as outsiders of that culture, just accept what's happening and never say a word about it. Right.
That's part of it. So that's some aspects, but in what I was looking at was a little bit more less getting into the morality aspect. So that's one way to look at it, like, which is, are some cultures better than others in terms of, and this is an interesting question that you often hear philosophers talking about, normative kinds of considerations. So, those which bring about more cooperation perhaps are better than those that, segregate people and have one kind of caste that's dominating others from a kind of a moral perspective. But my arguments were purely in terms of productivity. So are some cultures more productive than others?
In terms of,
so goods, production of goods for the amount of time. So my argument was that, and this is historical materialism generally, and also, I guess it was Leon Trotsky actually who has this theory. It was called the theory of uneven and combined development. So hunting and gathering societies, because of their low level of technological development, so Stone Age technology as opposed to Iron Age technology,
are less productive.
they're less productive.
Yeah. Okay.
The societies are smaller, and they're less complex, so they have less of a division of labor than exists. So you can sort of see, like, for me, it just seems like this is self-evident. Like, I don't think it's all that controversial. Like, it's just factually correct. Because if you look at a small hunting and gathering society, and it's got nothing to do with, like, everyone was hunting, all societies were hunting and gathering societies originally. Like, that's, this is, some became feudal and then industrial and so on. But if you look at a modern nation state and the division of labor, you've got, millions of people, and then you have all these different occupations and so on doing different things. And then you look at a tribal society and you have, not very many different kinds of occupations which exist there.
Right. So, like, it seems to be just an objective, observation that you're making, and it's not.
Anyway, and so my view was that this, because you have these very, very different levels of development, if indigenous cultures don't kind of adopt some of the more developed characteristics, and it's like wage labor, things associated with wage labor, things associated with the political system. So what's called legal rational authority. So, everyone understands that they're part of a legal system, and that if you hire someone for a job, it should be based upon their capacity to do it, not because they're a relative, which is like the kinship tribal kind of way of interacting is based upon, your kinship relations. And then knowledge, this is where it really starts to get unpopular, is, science is a much more developed way of understanding the world than, learning by example and, observing things in not a systematic way, which is how all peoples historically used to kind of learn things. Is you would just, see that there was a lot of fish coming at this time, and you would learn that, but there was nothing systematic and, as you were saying, falsifiable and hypothesis testing and theory building. And this is all part of the scientific method. That's a much more advanced way of understanding things than the way everyone used to do things traditionally. Anyway.
Yeah, I think we've fallen into this trap where we romanticize the way that Indigenous people, historically lived, and we think that it was a society that was cooperative and there was never any conflict whatsoever, and they were progressive in terms of gender acceptance and all of these things, and there's misconceptions, and but I'm wondering if you can tell us more about how, what was it like historically for Indigenous peoples? Because I've heard that there was slavery happening between, and there was like group conflicts, one tribe against another, and things like that. Can you paint a picture of what it might have been like in a more realistic way?
So this is obviously a matter of great debate.
Yeah, no, yeah.
And it's difficult because, and so this is pre-contact. So what has to be understood is that there's pre-contact, and then there was contact, and then there was post-contact, which many of the characteristics of the indigenous groups that developed at the post-contact time were due to the combination of the two. So they're a mixture of the two characteristics. But in terms of the pre-contact period, so in the evolutionary literature, so the figures that I draw my theories from in the anthropological literature, the cultural evolutionists, who Gordon Childe is the most well-known. He was an archaeologist, actually. And I really don't think, people tell me, oh, this is the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1950s. This is all, people don't think like that anymore. Like those, but we went postmodern. Like we became relativistic in the 60s and the 70s. So anthropology after the 60s really is just, there's really nothing very much there to take seriously, in my view. So we go back, we have to just get rid of all the postmodern stuff and go back to the serious evolutionary thinkers, Gordon Childe being the main one. And it comes out of the work of Edward Tyler and Lewis Henry Morgan, who were both very famous anthropologists, kind of like the fathers of anthropology. They had different levels, different stages of development. The earliest stage being what was called by Morgan savagery, which is now a politically incorrect term. And then the next stage was what Morgan called barbarism. And savagery, according to Morgan, was a particular technological stage. So it had his argument was certain technologies were part of savagery. And then once you reached another, you developed some new, more productive technologies, then you became what he called barbarous. And this was not a value, like everyone.
It's just an objective finding.
Yeah,
it's
it was just a term.
what happened.
What happened is that people would call people, you're a savage or something, like it would be used as an insult. Like if you're behaving in a way that was, uncouth or something, people would call you now savage. And so then it became this negative word, but it wasn't. So savagery had technologies like, for example, the bow and arrow was part, and it had lower, middle, upper, and then but it's largely associated with hunting and gathering. It is savagery, and barbarism was largely associated with horticulture, which is not field agriculture, but it's like you burn down tree stumps and you plant the crops within the kind of, not a field, but like within the stumps and so on. But you could have exceptions. Some hunters and gatherers were, relatively speaking, very advanced. And this was the case in the Northwest Coast Pacific groups because of the large amount of salmon and shellfish. So you had large surpluses. So you have large surpluses, and that allows for the flowering of various cultural characteristics and
because you're not worried about just getting food at the end of the day.
Yeah, so if you're having to spend all your time trying to hunt, you don't have a lot of time to develop other technologies. And so in the Northwest Coast, you had quite a lot of very advanced, for hunters and gatherers, quite advanced technology. So that's the kind of thing. The slavery question is very contentious. And some are saying it's not really slavery what's being talked about, because slavery is when you actually own someone else. What you often found in indigenous societies is that they would kill the men and absorb the women from other tribes. And those women then, because they were from another tribe, would have a lower status, and their children would have lower status than children who were from the original. So you had a kind of a status differential. And they was
in their new, as they got kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like taken into the new tribe, they're now a lower class kind of citizen, I guess.
But this is very, and this is something I've taken there's a really good book by an anthropologist by the name of Morton Fried, Fried, called, and actually it's in my bookshelf right here. This is a very, very interesting book called The Evolution of Political Society. And he traces this. He ranks political organization. So he's looking at the politics from what he calls egalitarian societies to what he called, I think it's called rank societies. And then you have these kinds of intermediate, like it's called I think it's called stratified. Those are very unstable because the kinship principle is, it's when you have groups that are excluded from obtaining the resources that they need to survive. And that's kind of land ownership. Certain groups own the land and they exclude others. Whereas the egalitarian, I think they're called rank societies, don't exclude anyone from the resources that they need to survive. What you have is you have different, like some members of groups get the better cuts of meat and things like that. They get better things, but they don't have actually ownership rights, which kind of prevent others from accessing those resources. And whenever you have that kind of situation, that's when you need what's called a state. You have a state, which is the armed force that holds people down and prevents them from accessing these resources. And they have to work the land. So feudalism is a good example of that. The serfs, they have to work the land, which is not owned by them. And as a part of the conditions, they have to give part of what they produce to the lord.
This would have been
this is what's called class societies. Whenever you have class societies, and slavery is seen as being an aspect of class society generally, not as an aspect of rank society. So that's something that would have to, and Fried is arguing strongly against. He's saying no, there was no slavery in the Northwest Coast societies because it was not a class society, it was a rank society. But this is highly contentious again. So this was all, trundling along really, really well in anthropology up until the 60s, because these arguments were going on, and you would have people arguing, yes, there is slavery, and people who are arguing, no, there wasn't slavery. And this was all very, very fruitful. But then postmodernism came in the 60s and said, well, there is no truth. And so it's just how the societies see themselves. And then we lost the kind of universal academic kind of understanding of things.
Yeah, what I find striking is that you're not even advocating necessarily for seeing it one way. You're not saying, look, I have the truth about what happened. When I asked you about it, you said, well, there's different theories and stuff. You're not saying you have the absolute truth about everything. You're just wanting to discuss the issues. And I don't know how our society has just completely lost that value. It seems like people maybe who are younger, who haven't necessarily experienced real oppression and real, fight for survival and things like that. They just maybe view our society as being just, I guess, so not powerful, but just permanent. I guess they don't think that it can ever be taken from them. And I think that's one of the main things that actually woke me up in the beginning was when I heard Jordan Peterson talk about this, how like what an amazing accomplishment it is that we can live in the West. We don't have to worry about starving. We don't have to worry about anything. We just go to a store, we can buy groceries, we can get a job, we can not be, dying of anything like that. But people have lost touch with how amazing that is. And it's sad, because one of the things that keeps it going is exactly what you're fighting for right now, which actually we should get into what happened to you and stuff, because you've been fired from Mount Royal University simply for having these different opinions and wanting to explore the truth and whatnot. But yeah, it's the battle of our lives, really. And
Yeah, but just to mention, because this kind of dovetails onto your situation, is, I think I tend to side with Freed. So my view is, I think Freed is probably correct in comparison to other people arguing for slavery. But that's my, and I'll articulate those arguments and I'll provide evidence and so on. My objection is the notion that the university would take a side on these matters, which is what
I printed out what is written on Mount Royal University's website here. Okay, it's like I just can't get over this. So they say the foundation of academic freedom dictates that intellectual exploration must be carried out without regard for prevailing political winds, a popular opinion, or personal considerations. At Mount Royal, academic freedom is considered a fundamental right of faculty. And I mean, on top of that, you were a tenured professor. I mean, to my knowledge, I'm not sure, but I thought it was virtually impossible to fire a tenured professor. Like, you'd have to be wildly incompetent or have committed some kind of serious crime or something like that, right? So how is it? What is even the reason that they gave you for firing you? Because sorry, my dad. No, I didn't realize she was in the frame. Can you see her the whole time?
Yeah.
Ah, that's funny.
This is one part of life. So for people who are interested in this, the specifics of it, there's a website called woke-academy.info. And on that website, there is the termination letter is on that website. And there were 12 reasons why I was fired. And they largely had to do with the view that, but it's similar to your situation in that they added a bunch of things on later on. So the real reason was they found my interactions on social media to be harassment. That was largely why.
And this was because of your satire Twitter account?
So what happened is I for many years, and actually this is on the web, on the woke-academy website under I think it's episode 16, which is about what happened to me between 2016 and 2019, which was I was being constantly undermined and insulted and had all sorts of things happening, which were trying to paint me as a racist and an anti-Indigenous person. And at the time, I was not happy about this because I felt that it was being used to try to push me out of Mount Royal University, make my ability to conduct myself, and I knew this was probably going to be the case. So I kept records of all this, and I would send, I think I sent 7 letters to administrators over the 4 years, telling them about what was happening, and they didn't do anything about it. And in fact, they even promoted 2 of the people who were the worst kinds of offenders of this. So I was kind of thinking at the time, well, I don't want to stop these people from speaking because I'm a free speech advocate. So I'll just have to, put up with it. And then, when the time comes that I get people attempt to push me out, I'll just hold up these 7 letters and say, this is what's been happening to me. So, please forgive me if I'm a little bit, perhaps I, acted in a slightly, angry way or something like that. But in 2020, with the George Floyd killing. This is when there's already wokeism, which is identity politics, which has become totalitarian, what's called reified postmodernism, where you have to accept the oppressed identities. And if you don't, then you're going to, be subjected to the kinds of things that you've been subjected to and so on. Anyway, when this all of a sudden things became much more highly politicized in a very, very short space of time, and you start to get these political pronouncements. You had the president of Mount Royal saying that, when someone tells him that they're a victim of racism, he just believes it because it's their lived experience. And when I was hearing things like this, I was going, people are calling me a racist here. Like, they've been doing it for 4 years. And if you're just going to believe people saying that someone's that's not going to be good. So anyway, my colleague Sinclair McRae, who's a philosopher, wrote this really good response to this kind of politicization was happening. And everyone just ignored what he had written. And so I thought, this is not, it's kind of a strange thing to try to reason with people who don't accept reason.
Yeah.
So I thought, and I think I'd actually heard Toby Young, who's the head of the Free Speech Union. It might have been Andrew Doyle, who has Titania McGrath, the satirical character. They were sort of saying, trying to reason with these people is not going to be effective. It's actually satire that does work in terms of bringing out some of these contradictions. So at that point when Sinclair McRae's letter was ignored, I think it was July 1st, 2020, I wrote this satirical. So this group, which was anonymous, had put forth this open letter, which had insinuated, it didn't mention me by name, but it was saying there was this anti-Indigenous rhetoric that was going on at Mount Royal. And then another guy who had been pushed out of Mount Royal, Mark Hecht, for writing a op-ed in the Vancouver Sun saying that ethnic diversity undermines social trust, too much ethnic diversity. He got pushed out. Anyway, they mentioned these things in this letter. So I was going, oh, I don't like that. So, and then they wanted to bring in mandatory anti-racism training for everyone. So I thought, well, I should try the satirical approach here. So
right, because then they follow along at first, and then they think, like, they won't reject it off the bat because they actually think that you agree with them at first, and then it's like, oh, this
anyway, so
pushed too far.
I still think it's an excellent satirical letter, where I said, George Orwell had come to me in a dream, and he'd told me that although he knew I was a fan of his analysis of totalitarianism, this was not the right way. And it was actually intersectional postmodernism, which was the correct position. And then I said, after doing a territorial land acknowledgement, posting my pronouns on Twitter, praying to the creator, etc., I've decided on a path, the right course of action. And that is to develop an oppression point system where I'm going to give a point, or where the system is going to give a point to everyone, whether they're male or white or cis and so on. And then there had been 62 faculty members who had signed this open letter. And I blacked their names out. I accumulated with all their characteristics, identity characteristics. I blacked out their names so they were not identified. And I said, everyone, and I gave them points, suppression points. And there's a lot, there's, I think 40%, which had very high score on this system. And I said, they should, put their money where their mouth is and resign.
Yeah.
To make room for the BIPOC scholars, because of course, tenured positions are very hard to come by. And if we want to get the representation up, then, some people are going to have to resign. And since they're in favor of this system, then anyway, this got people going.
It wasn't received well, I can imagine.
Yeah, it was.
People don't want to give up their own stuff.
So people at that point started to get angry a bit about
Yeah.
they started to kind of think, we got to get her out of here. And then the Wendy Mesley case came along very shortly after that. And I was defending Mesley, and I got set up by this troll, which I knew I was being set up because this person was arguing in other contexts that I was a racist and so on. So I knew they were trying to get me to mention this word anyway. So Wendy Mesley got her career ended because she, mentioned the word "quote unquote" nigger, and had the book titled "White Niggers of America." She was mentioning an anti-racist context. It was a private meeting, etc. And she got pushed out of CBC. And I could not believe that this had happened to her, and no one was standing up for her.
Mhm.
And so this troll asked me and I was careful not to mention the word because I knew I was getting.
Yeah, there's no use mention distinction
No.
anymore there.
Anyway, so when I got asked by this troll, if the word is so benign, why don't you use it? I thought, well, Lenny Mesley didn't do anything wrong. And if I'm going to be principled about this, I'll use and mention the word in the same way that Wendy Mesley had. And I did that. And that's when Indigenous scholar who was angry at me already went after me and
Yeah.
tried to mobilize this anonymous student group, and about 41 faculty members I counted one time. I mapped them all out, all their activities, and I was arguing with them. I argued with them for a couple of weeks, and it was just clear that they were not going to accept. They just kept on saying, "You're a racist." I'm going, well,
Yeah.
what are you going to do about this book, Pierre Valier's book? Are you going to go through all the indexes and black out all the, remove all the covers, the book covers? Like, what? You're a racist. You're a racist. Like, "Ugh." So I just got settled. Okay, that's it. I'm doing the satire. So I started just doing this satirical kind of stuff when they were trying to get me fired. So I would satirize their efforts to get me fired as this character, Frances McGrath, which was modeled on the Andrew Doyle character, Titania McGrath. And then this person who was trying to get me fired, she filed a harassment complaint against me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I have a few questions. So, first of all, they say you're anti-Indigenous. Is that just, so obviously it's just because you oppose some of the big narratives that they believe, and you're trying to get to the truth and whatnot. But from what I've seen, aren't your criticisms kind of, aren't you like advocating for better policies to help Indigenous people? Like, can you explain how what you're doing is actually pro-Indigenous and not anti-Indigenous? Because I mean, it's what you're doing, from what I've observed, is you're saying that the policies that we're going along with right now are actually hurting Indigenous people more than they're helping them, because there's all these lawsuits going on and all of this stuff, this money is going to the communities, but it's not, I mean, first of all, it goes to select members of the communities and in select communities, and it's not helping them to actually secure a sustainable kind of future and help them get off the ground. It's just a band-aid solution. Yeah,
and that's what, this is why I used to get really angry about this when people were doing this. Now I see it as a tactic to ostracize me and make it impossible for me to exist in the university system. But Albert Howard and I, when we wrote the first book, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, we thought at the time that this would be, Indigenous people would understand, and maybe they do, I don't know. It's the industry that is the problem. That we were identifying the non-Indigenous parasitical element that is feeding off of the misery of Indigenous people, using that misery for what's called rent-seeking kind of behavior. So you've got these terrible conditions in Indigenous communities. You use that to sort of start all these legal kinds of challenges of various kinds. But then that the problem that is facing Indigenous people is not a lack of money. Like there's, I'm not sure, it's like 15 billion or 20, it's like huge amounts of money going in. But most of that is not going into the communities. It's going into all these kinds of what's called the Aboriginal industry type of processes, which prevents any kind of meaningful development within Indigenous communities. So that's kind of the key, is that what's being proposed, like the whole way of thinking about it, because it denies the theory of uneven combined development. It denies that. It talks about that, you know, Indigenous societies, there should be kind of parallel societies, all with their own laws and economies and everything, when the developmental gap is so large that you will never be able to have hunting and gathering societies that have universities and hospitals and so on. You need much more productivity in order for that to occur. And if you're going to have much more productivity, then you need to have all the kind of legal processes in place so that you don't just have one privileged group sort of siphoning off all that money in various ways.
Right.
Now, like there's
kind of like BLM does.
I'm a critic
right?
of capitalism, so I think there's a lot of problems with capitalism, but that's another issue dealing with that. I'm just talking about kinship-based societies do not have a highly developed political type of system and legal system. So when you have large amounts of money going into a community, that's
And
not
no
gonna,
functional hierarchy, you're saying? Like no
they don't have
functional.
a legal system in place. So like this is what should be happening in the communities is you have this $15 billion, $20 billion. It's like, okay, well, what do we need? We need to fix the water systems here. We need to have the housing, we need to have all these things. And then you have, you know, bureaucratic entities that will now go in and do that and supply those services. That's not what happens now. It is, no, you give the Indigenous leadership the money, right? Well, after all the processes have taken place, which just takes a huge chunk out. So you have, you know, all the lawyers and the consultants and everything rake off a bunch. And then you have the rest of that money goes into the communities. Then it's all distributed according to on a kinship-based system. So that means if you are closely connected, you're closely related to the chief, you're going to get the best house. And if you're not connected, you're not going to get anything, that sort of thing. So you have this worsening and worsening kind of social conditions that really need to have a, you know, a state of emergency type of situation. So
Okay, and so what is the solution to this in your view? Like, I don't know if you can sum it up quickly, but like, how should we be dealing with this? How should we help Indigenous people?
Well, they
in a way that's
actually is the system is in place, which is the federal government can combine with the provinces. So this is another problem with Indigenous policy, is that because it's a federal responsibility, there's all this kind of blame game that goes on between the federal government and the provincial government. So the provinces are the ones that are used to providing education, healthcare, and so on. So the provincial governments should take over the service provision and have accountability and measurable targets and so on that goes on. So instead of just sending money all the time, it should be services, which are the focus. And that there's enough money because there's like $20 billion or whatever that's going in. So that's something that is already possible within the system. The difficulty is the terrible conditions that exist in these communities, because those communities are not viable. People don't understand this. Like, it's always kind of, well, we'll just build them up and it will be like, you know, Red Deer or something like that, you know, like, but that's not why those communities are not associated with any economy. They were created to deal with Indigenous dependency, and there's got to be some kind of integration strategy that's developed, but it's not worked well at all in the past. It's been a terrible situation. And even in some groups, like Newfoundland is a good example of this. So Newfoundland, when the fisheries collapsed, and when you had this remote outposts because all these, they paid people to come into the larger centers and so on. And there's a lot of unhappiness with that situation, that the loss of fishing life and community life that existed in these outposts. So there's a lot of older people who are very unhappy with that situation. And that is nothing. That situation is nothing compared to the problems that are going to face any attempts to deal with these unviable Indigenous communities. But there's basically two important things that need to happen. One is the educational levels in these communities, which are very, very low. And you have a terrible fetal alcohol syndrome problem in these communities, which like that.
What percentage of, I read something recently, I was blown away by the proportion of the people who have this syndrome, but do you know offhand what?
It's not studied because they don't want to, like, this is not going to be something that people are going to hear. But I remember, I've heard 30%. That's what I've heard. Now that's just like people's anecdotal kinds of feelings about it. When I was doing research on the Northern Quebec, they did a survey asking teenage girls if they drank when they were pregnant. And I think it was 25% said that they drank when they were pregnant. And that's probably low. So if you're going to ask people whether they drink when they're pregnant in a survey, chances are many people will say that they don't, because they don't want to, they're going to feel ashamed of that. So 25% perhaps is a good figure. Anyways, it's quite a large, and the prisons, if you look at the prison population, this is often left out. There's a high percentage of people in prisons who have fetal alcohol syndrome as well. And that's partially, the large indigenous populations in the prisons that has connected to fetal alcohol syndrome. So like, how does that, first of all, we have to recognize that is an issue, which is no one's talking about. And then we have the educational kinds of challenges that come with that. And then we have the unviability of the communities, which those can't, like, people are
like in terms of productivity and
yeah, they have no economic base. So if you have people living in an area where they have no productive ability to contribute to the economy, they will feel hopeless and they'll feel like they don't matter, because
they'll be nihilistic, and then they might turn to,
and so this
solutions,
is all so this is the kind of the huge monumental kind of challenges about these communities. And what happens is that you, instead of kind of focusing on those communities, which are should be the focus, we talk to these what's called the neo-tribal elites, who are completely integrated into, who are professors often, and they're telling us the solution is more separation. And they're completely integrated. So they're successful because they have integrated, and they've got university degrees, and they're living in, Winnipeg or what have you. And they're telling us the solution is more separate parallel societies, which seems to be not what's
and they're completely removed from the realities of these communities, right? It's it is like BLM too. You've got these people who we're funneling money to, and
I've heard that with
we
BLM.
don't know.
BLM, often Black people who live in these communities are saying, well, we don't want the police to fund it. Like, we think the police could do a better job and whatever, and not be profiling people and so on. But we want the police in our communities because we're dealing with all this crime in our communities, and we need. So the BLM activists are saying defund the police, and then the Black people who are living in the communities are saying, no, that's not what we, it's like, so there's this kind of
such a disconnect. Well,
okay,
so I really admire your feistiness and your willingness to stand for what's right, and I mean, we're, I guess, both in the same boat where we're taking a more difficult path, but to stand for what's right. And I'm curious about what is like, have you always been a little bit more feisty? What's your personality like? If like, did this whole situation just bring out this characteristic in you, or were you always a little bit outspoken, rebellious, whatever?
I always kind of, historically, I was much more, lacked confidence. I lacked, until I guess when I was doing my PhD and so on, I lacked confidence. So I would always feel like, I remember being in many situations where I would be very, I wouldn't agree with any of these things in very, like, not necessarily even the wokeism stuff, but just generally, I wouldn't, but I feel I just don't have the confidence to speak up about this.
That's very interesting to me. Wow.
And then when I met Albert Howard in the North, so, you know, and this is kind of an important thing for people, you know, in terms of your relationships that you have, you know, he would kind of say to me, like, why are you not, like, you should, if you think you're right, you should pursue it. Like, you shouldn't back down if you think you're right. Like, that's a terrible thing to do. If it turns out you're wrong, then you can just say, well, I made a mistake, or like, you should do that. Like, you shouldn't just like hold on to your thing and fight, you know, regardless of whatever. But you should, if you think you're right, you should pursue it until you're shown that you're wrong. And then if you're showing you're wrong, you should say, okay, yeah, I made a mistake. So that mentality of, you know, having the courage of your convictions, you know, like that's a very difficult thing to develop. But once you do it, then, you know, you can't stop. Like, it's very, like, now it's impossible. Like, this is why, in terms of my case, you know, I will not compromise on this at all, because, you know, I have now, you know, 5 years now, I've been battling well, indigenization was the major kind of area, but it's wokeism is the wider thing. And you never get any arguments from these people. Like, and you probably noticed that as well. Oh, you noticed that with your Facebook.
Oh my gosh, I try to talk to people. Sometimes, man, I've been losing patience though. Like the last few days, I've just, at first I was trying to be so nice and stuff, and now I'm like, I just can't. It's always the same arguments. It's either you don't know what CRT is, CRT isn't in schools, or they'll use some emotional kind of thing where it's like, well, don't you care about blah blah blah.
Well, I saw in the
yes, I do.
Like, when you were doing your the thing that you got in trouble for, right? Just in terms of the things that you posted,
Yeah.
everyone just, you know, kind of had this. Don't you realize that you're hurting and harming people, and what you said is really upsetting, and like, that's the kind of level.
We don't accept that here. You can't have this opinion here.
So,
like, it's, yeah.
And so if this is all people have as their argument, then it seems likely that there's no there, you know, like that there really is nothing to this, if this is what people are going to be putting forward. So then just stand your ground, right? Stand your ground, fight it out. The worst thing that people do, and this is what Wendy Masley did,
is apologize.
She did this horrible groveling apology, which I'm not sure if she believed or not, or she just felt this is the way to save her career.
Probably that.
So, that's not going to save you. Like, that's
it's going to make it worse.
It's going to make it worse because they're going to sense weakness in you. But also, it's deflating for the people who are trying to support you, because here you're trying to mobilize this group of people, and then you apologize. It's like, well,
yeah. I mean, if you feel you've actually done something wrong, you've been proven wrong on something, fine. I have no problem with apologizing. I'm always willing to be told that I'm incorrect and to change my views, but I will certainly not be apologizing for having reasonable views that to me still stand. And I think people who do that are I mean, I can understand in the moment, if you're a reasonable person, you're like, oh my gosh, all these people are coming at me, I must be wrong. But just wait it out, wait a week and think about it, because
Yeah.
Apologizing is the worst thing. They take it as an admission that you're guilty,
Yep.
and they will not let you go until you're
No.
destroyed.
And so, and it's a very good point you make there, which is, this is not about, and people said that about me. Oh, well, that's her principles. Not, well, I don't apologize if I've done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
Like if I've done something wrong, that's another matter. Then we can talk about it. But you're gonna have to convince me that I was wrong, and I'm gonna have to make sure that it's not just I'm being bullied or something like that. But if I don't think I've done anything wrong, why would and it's like, even from the point of view, as you were saying, you somehow making it easy on yourself, that's not gonna work anyway. So forget, it's gonna be, people are gonna be taking it easy on you because they're not gonna get worse. And secondly, it's completely unprincipled, and it's a failure of, I guess, courage. Like, people need courage. You need to well, toughen up. Like, that's what first thing is, that if you're gonna go down this road, you got to be tough. You got to be very, very tough. So toughen up.
This is what I did from the beginning. When I started learning about all these issues, I'm just going to explain sort of what my thought process was, because it might help others maybe do the same thing. So I told myself that there are certain things that I will not allow in our society. For example, I don't want to treat people differently because of their skin color. So I told myself, I will allow myself to say that I think that people should be treated equally, because that's something that I really stand by. And like, I don't want to be in a society that doesn't think that way. I will risk my job. I will risk a lot of stuff to stand by that principle. So anyway, I told myself, I will say these things, and if I get in trouble for it, I will pay the price. I will suck up the cost, right?
Mhm.
Like, I think everybody has to think about what their boundaries are, because I think we just get so kind of swept up in the wave of, we don't necessarily see what's happening, that we're being brought from one step to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other, and we never stop to think, hey, is this in line with my actual personal values? Like, has this gone too far? 10 years ago, would I have been advocating for separating Black people and white people? I mean, just recently they announced that I think it was the University of Toronto that's going to be offering a bachelor's degree in Black health. I mean, what comes next? Segregated hospitals? Like, so everybody has to draw a line in the sand and say, look, I am willing to pay the cost for saying X, Y, or Z. And you have to have those beliefs thought through and be able to defend them, and be able to know that if people come at you, you're going to stand by them regardless. And you might lose a Facebook friend, you might lose a follower, you might lose a lot. I mean, I've probably lost like 100 Facebook friends in the last year. Who cares? They weren't your friends to begin with.
I know, and it's good. It's good to know. Like, we should face reality. Like, we shouldn't live in a dream world. Like, this is not a good thing to be deluding ourselves about things. And I'm, gradually, like now, I think my own case, I don't know. I'm just sort of thinking about myself historically. I certainly remember, I guess it was 10 years ago, feeling much more, kind of worried about things. Like now I'm just, my own view now is, and similar to yours, which I find actually, because of your age, like I was at your age, I would never have had this, ability to do. It's been a gradual learning process. But now I'm saying to people, and this is the big battle I'm having with the unions and so on, is, my most important, the thing I want most of all is I want all of this to become public. I want everything to be known about my case, and then I'll deal with whatever consequences comes out of that, right? Mm-hmm. But what happens is you get, and this is the problem with unions, is that unions above all to save your job. So their thing. don't do this, don't do that. If you do, then, you might not be able to get, it's like, no, like, that is not the highest priority here. The highest priority is for people to be able to know what is going on in, well, Mount Royal in particular, but it's not Mount Royal, it's just one example, but there's like all over the country and in the United States as well, terrible dogmatic kinds of impositions where people are expected to just go along with whatever the official line is. And if they object to it, they get this kind of huge kind of groundswell against them. And that's not going to work for what we consider a university to be. The university will not function if you do not have people able to pursue questions in an open-ended way, right? But right now what it is that you must find this right answer. And if you don't find this right answer, then you are going to be pushed out. That's not a university as far as I'm concerned. And I don't think most people in Canada think that's a university. So if people could just see what's going on, then at least they would have an understanding of this is what we're dealing with. But I know, because I'm a board member for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, so I hear about a lot of cases that no one else ever hears about. And it's very rare you'll have someone go the distance on it, who will go through the whole arbitration process, because most people want to avoid arbitration. Because they're thinking, it's going to be very contentious, and it's going to be cross-examined by, my employers, and they're going to be trying to obviously, tear you down. But I say, bring it on.
I say bring it on too. I don't know what it is
I'm not afraid
about my personality, but I don't do well with bullies, and this is exactly what it is. And I'm repulsed by it, and anybody who's going along with it and who knows it's wrong and is just not saying anything, I'm repulsed by that too. It's almost worse in a way. It's so cowardly, and you're participating in basically the collapse of the West, because all of these principles are being trashed because you're staying quiet. And I am just so done with it. So done with it.
2 hours have passed, Chanel.
I feel like we could talk for 12, but yeah.
Anyway, so I could go on forever as well.
Yeah.
It's just that our listeners, I have 2 hours is a lot for people to listen to. So I think this has been great. I think you're doing, a heroic job. It's amazing for someone as young as you to be so confident, because, you feel like there's not a lot of support, at least public support. But I think it's people like you who are going to be able to, if we could just get other people, at least a certain critical mass together who had the same kind of sentiments, then we could battle this monster. But we haven't, it's hard to know how it's all going to turn out. But anyway, I think I'll draw it to a close, but I wanted to thank you very much, Chanel, for being on Rational Space Disputations. Do you have any final things to say, or how people can contact you, perhaps to express their support? I know you're on Facebook. They can find you relatively easily on Facebook, and you're on Twitter as well.
I'm on Twitter.
They can get in touch with you.
Twitter is probably the best way. I'm on Twitter at Chanel Pfahl. I guess you can post it maybe in the description if you want. But I just want to say thanks for having me on, and keep up the good fight. I mean, I think it's clear that we're on the right side of history, and I hope that other people start to speak up soon.
Yes. Thank you very much. It was great talking to you.
Thank you.